Hey there, history buffs. I'm Thomas Carroll, your host. Welcome to another episode of the History from the Homestead podcast. Today I'm talking to Spencer and Ray, and we're going to be talking about Frederick Duesenberg and his crash up on Laurel Mountain on Route 30. So, Spencer, Ray, thanks for joining me.
We're happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, we'll get started off here. You can choose amongst yourself who wants to go first, tell you a little bit about yourself and your knowledge of the subject at hand.
You go first.
Sure, I'll go first. So my name is Spencer Simpson. I'm the manager of visitor services at the Lincoln Highway Experience Museum in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. So just 13 miles away from the site of the incident, as we're going to talk about later on. I've been at the Lincoln Highway Museum for about 3.5 years, and probably a year into that, I got acquainted with Ray, who's here with us today. He came into the museum with a binder full of old postcards and some ideas about some things that are on the highway not too far from here. It was really the first that I had heard about there being an accident of Fred Duesenberg's in this area. And I had a rough idea of who he was, but it was really Ray talking to him here at the museum who really introduced me to the significance of who Fred Duesenberg was and the locality of the event. I'd seen the historical marker on the side of the road, but outside of that, I really had no idea of what went on and what the story was. And as Ray told me, pretty much from the beginning, he said, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm gonna keep coming back, and I'm gonna keep advocating for this story to be told." And over the course of the next year or two, we found some ways to make that happen here at the museum. We've hosted him for a lecture or two about the subject, and we have his book here in the bookstore, the gift shop of the museum. And most recently, Ray was instrumental in helping us put together a temporary exhibit space here at the museum about the research that he had from his book. So that was how I was introduced to Ray, and now I'm going to let him introduce himself to you.
My name's Ray Wotkowski. I'm a retired junior high principal from Forest Hills School District. I was an industrial arts teacher. I'm a father of two daughters, 5 grandchildren. I'm an antique car guy. The whole idea of this whole Duesenberg story kind of blossomed from a friend of mine who has a restoration shop in Beaverdale, Barry Esch. He gave me 4 articles. I hold the 4 articles in hand here. I'm showing you over the Zoom here. 2 of them were from 1932, one was from 1981, and one was from 2004. And each of those dates will make more sense as we go into the story. What I did was I researched this to a point, and the Classic Car Club magazine, they offered to edit my story for their magazine. And Chris Summers was the assistant editor, and he and I worked together on that. Because he knew I was a principal for 26 years, he was a little touchy about stepping on my toes. I said, "You can't hurt my feelings." I said, I was a principal in the middle school. I have no feelings. I have no heart. I have no anything of that. Don't worry about it. So he did a really good job of making it fit the Classic Car magazine. And my friend Dale Holder he bought a bunch of them because he was really supportive of this from the get-go. And he shared it with one of his friends. One of his friends read it and said, that's a great story. He said, but I have one problem. He said, "What's that?" He said, "I want more." So there was a lot more that was not in the article. And I said, okay, over COVID, I just, every flat spot in my kitchen had notes and things. I have my binder with me. And every little bit that I was able to dig out, I was talking to Spencer before, it's exciting when you find new information. The sources could be anywhere from an acquaintance to, and I'll tell you that mine all started at the post office in Jennerstown. I was there asking where one of the sons of Eugene Walter, who actually drove the car that weekend during the 4th of July holiday. So, and I'll tell you more about that, but that's how I got interested in the story. I'm an antique car guy. My friend gave me these articles. And I started digging into the thing, and the Classic Car Club magazine assistant editor, gave me some good pointers. He said, you need to look at obituaries, you need to look at old newspapers, and, um, uh, and other kind of community types of things that would include churches and anything. So it's kind of cool. So that's the start of it. For understanding, when I present this, I presented this probably, I don't know, more than a dozen times. I have a PowerPoint. It takes about 40 minutes to do it properly, and then have about 10 minutes for questions. That's a typical format. And the first thing I do is give an idea, a little baseline of who Fred Duesenberg was. And so if we're going to start there, I think that might be a good idea. Fred and Augie Duesenberg, they came over with their widow mother. There were 7 children, and they went to Iowa, so on a farm. So his whole career and everything started in Iowa. He and his younger brother Augie were inseparable, but Fred was the face of the company. He was the one that would do the talking and whatever. But Augie was an equal partner. He was right in there. So the two of them started on the farm, and I'm gonna try to generalize this. So they started with that, and then they went into bicycles. And Fred had this uncanny ability to just analyze how things work. He never had any formal education other than a correspondence course on drafting. Yet he accomplished things that the engineers could not. He was that gifted. He was that kind of a guy, a natural. And so went from the farm to bicycle. He was a national holder for, I think, the 2 and 3 mile bicycle racing back in the that would have been in the 20s, teens and 20s. And he held that record, I believe, for 7 to 10 years. He was that driven of a guy. Then he and his brother, of course, they found a motor, and they motorized a bike, which made it a kind of little motorcycle kind of thing. And Fred worked for a couple different, he worked for the Rambler, and there was another company he worked for. He actually raced, his initial racing experience was with the Mason company. And eventually Mason used the Duesenberg engine on their car. They ran in the dirt tracks. There were wooden raceways. In the display here at the museum, we have a copy of a program from 1924. I'm showing you, it looks like there are 3 cars here in the center are Duesenbergs. We have the racing. This is one of the Duesenbergs at Indy, and you probably can't see, but it's on bricks because Indy was the brickyard, is the brickyard. They raced on bricks. And so there are various pieces with that. They actually won the Indianapolis 500 in 1922, 1924, 25, and 27. In the other years, they placed. And so pretty much the Duesenberg in the racing field dominated for a decade. And there were the big name companies like Stutz, and of course Mercedes was racing back then too. But there were some really big names he had to deal with. And what he would do is he would train, not only build the cars and make the engine be able to last the entire race, because many of the cars back then would just break down. They didn't have enough oil capacity, or they didn't have enough cooling capacity to maintain a full throttle in racing conditions. And he was able to figure out how to do that. He had multiple valves per cylinder. He actually patented, it was called a walking beam engine, which would put the cams up on top of the engine, because back in those days the cams were down deep in the engine, and he was able to redesign the engine to put the cams on top, which made them more efficient. So that was the racing part of it. He and his brother, they were able to refine the use of 2 things. They were able to refine using hydraulic brakes and the supercharger. Now, Mercedes introduced the supercharger to racing, but Fred and Augie refined it to the point where it was successful on the racetrack. So if you think about it, they were able to go faster right away because of the supercharger. They were able to slow down better in the turns, and that added to their success in Indy and other places. One other thing, one of their accomplishments, they were the only car to ever win the French Grand Prix. So in my book, I said that they were the first car, and Fred Simeon from the Simeon Museum in Philadelphia, when he was reading over my story, he said, nah, they were the only American car. So I let a lot of car people read this thing, like the book. The book is a product of a lot of car people. I did a lot of the research. I put it together, but there's a lot of contributions from a lot of good car people that are just like somewhat historians, more than just car buffs. They really know their stuff, and they were very excited to not only hear this story, but would see the information I have and how I found the information. That the information is based on people who touched, owned, and drove the car. So that's kind of a basic for the Duesenbergs. So you had to know that they were well known for racing. And then there was this one guy that came around. His name was E.L. Cord. He was the guy with the money, and he went up to Fred Duesenberg in a time when the Duesenberg company was in receivership. How did they get in receivership? Well, they didn't have much money, and they tried to go into the domestic car business. For 5 years, they did, but without a lot of money, it's hard to develop the car. That's why the big three survived, and all of the independents were eventually going to be fall by the wayside. So that's what happened with them. And E.L. Cord, who was, I'll call him a glorified car salesman, but he actually would know the market extremely well. He did a lot of things. He failed in a lot of his businesses, but the Duesenberg thing that he did, the project of having the fastest, most luxurious car in America and in the world, actually, was one of the best in the world. That was his dream. Not only that, it was a dream that was to have the Cord car by itself with the hidden headlights. That was his other dream. But when he went to Fred, when they were in receivership, he made Fred Duesenberg the vice president of the company. He said, I want you to build me the fastest, most luxurious car. Now, Fred didn't build the bodies. Fred built the chassis, the motors, the instrumentation, and they would drive them 500 miles on Indy Speedway to test them, to make sure that they went over 100 mile in second gear, and naturally over 100 mile in third gear. The cars were huge. The car that he was driving in this story had 142-inch wheelbase. That would be equivalent to an extended cab pickup truck. And the car is set up high. And to have that kind of speed, and that it didn't have a real low center of gravity, it was just, you can look at photos of them, but until you see one, and I've been out to the Auburn Cord Duesenberg Festival in Auburn, Indiana. I saw a dozen of them, and it was cool. It was just something. You don't know how big and luxurious it is till you see it. You can't see that from the photos. So E.L. Cord said, I want you to build me this chassis, and then we'll get the custom people to build the custom bodies on them. And of course, the movie stars all had to have a Duesenberg. Clark Gable, Gary Cooper, and many others in that time had to be seen with this newfangled thing called the fancy automobile. And the fact that it can go that fast, there were no roads to drive it on that fast, but the fact that it could go that fast kind of was the motivation, almost like having a Lamborghini. There are no roads you can go 200 miles an hour. But if you know you can do it, it's kind of a bragging thing of making it in the world. So that's the baseline of Duesenberg. I don't know if you have any questions at this point in time about maybe it's something that they accomplished. There's a lot more that could be said about him. I'm not an expert on Duesenberg. I know a little bit more than a little, but I don't present myself as being an expert for his accomplishments and what he did specifically with the motors and all that other things. But I do know that they were that he was gifted. I do know that they created this tremendous automobile that was superior to any other car that was out there, and it was that way for a good 10 years. And that was in the racing and the domestic car field there. So if you have any questions yet.
Um, well, not specific questions, but
Okay.
you think about you see the pictures of the cars. They're going, as you said, over 100 miles an hour they're capable of going, and they were, obviously not built like we have today. I imagine these cars were uh, quite a handful to run at speed, whether on a track or on road.
A lot of people died because
Yeah.
they weren't safe. They were on the edge of things. And they raced these on wooden raceways before they had the technology to make the cement on such an angle. They had wooden raceways. I know that they had one in Uniontown. I know they had one in Tipton, right outside of Altoona. I
Mm-hmm.
have photos from it, and actually I have them with me. They're not. I don't think they're in the book, but they will be in the book in the next edition if I do one. So that was the racing part. They raced on in dirt, and again, you have to keep in mind, you know, in the late 20s, the economy was going crazy, and then in 29, of course, we had the stock market crash. So, that impacted Duesenberg's domestic car plans, but it did not impact E.L. Court because he saw this market in the very wealthy people that were out there. And the car that they were driving was a 1930 Murphy built disappearing roof, rumble seat. Uh, I think there's another name that was added to it. I forget what it is right now, but it was supercharged. It had an experimental supercharger on it, and there's a picture of it in the book. So it was a pretty hot car. It had this. It didn't have the pipes. We think of the Duesenberg having the individual pipes coming out, and some of them did, but this thing had a big manifold that came out of the side, and it was all chrome. It was like it would jump out. And in that 1932 realm, if you saw this big chrome uh, manifold off coming out of the side of the car, you would know it just like we would know a Lamborghini today. So
It,
that was the car he was driving, and I can get into the story, but that's the baseline that I tell before we get into the story. Uh, I have information from a lawsuit from his wife trying to get compensation after his death, so I know exactly why he made his trip. I know where he went. I know what he did, people he talked to. I know whose car I know a lot of the facts that are there. And as I tell Spencer and others, I know what I know. There are some things I don't know, but what I know is pretty nailed down. So,
yeah.
and I've corrected history, and through this, as I was described, rabbit hole investigation that I did, I believe that I've preserved history as well.
Yeah, and everybody loves going down a rabbit hole. I know I do. Um, what will maybe here we'll talk a little bit about the trip, and because it happened on the Lincoln Highway or Route 30. We'll give Spencer a chance to get in here. Because that this happened a mere probably 2 miles from where I live, and I was the same way. I didn't know anything about it until I saw the little white marker on the side of the road and stopped to see it.
Well,
Yeah.
the first thing I can tell you about that white marker is that it was put in the wrong place.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I had lunch with two of the gentlemen that were instrumental in making that thing, putting that together and putting it where it was. And I had to convince them that it was on the wrong side of the mountain. And talk about one guy's jaw dropped, the other guy, until he was riding back to over this side of the mountain back to Latrobe, he wasn't convinced that it was in a wrong place. Again, the basis of my story and my research is based on people who owned the car, drove the car, and touched the car. So, as you'll see when we talk about the story, what the father of the three brothers who found where the car was in 2001, they actually it wasn't 21, it was 80. 2001, yeah. Um, they, um, they were able to talk, and I have an interview that they had with their dad. Their dad actually drove the car. So I'll tell you the story. It'll
Yeah.
make more sense. But again, um, the whole basis of everything I have is as close as you can come to the car as you can get. So,
So, Spencer, we'll talk about Route 30 for a few minutes. And we're not going to dive into it too deep because that's a whole other show. But it's an important part of this because you were talking when this happened, there was not a large number of long distance highways in America at the
Correct.
time.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so as I'm sure probably most of your audience is already familiar, the Lincoln Highway was a revolutionary road. It was the first road of its kind in the country. The Lincoln Highway Association being founded by businessmen of America, many of whom in the automobile industry, many of whom avid cyclists recreationally, much like Fred Duesenberg, actually. Bicycling was there's our motion sense lights. Bicycling was a prominent hobby of the time for many people, and the problem that they experienced was that roads were often pretty well paved or bricked in individual towns, but you couldn't ride your bike outside of town. Often cases you could only ride your bike on Main Street, otherwise you'd be getting stuck in the mud or having too bumpy of a ride to really make it an enjoyable one. So the Good Roads movement was originally targeted toward cyclists. And many of the business owners that would become part of the Lincoln Highway Association were first part of the Good Roads movement because of their interest in bicycling recreationally. So in 1913, a number of these businessmen, a number of these members of the Good Roads movement got together to form the Lincoln Highway Association. And the goal was to raise $10 million of public donor funds, privately donated funds from their individual companies and their trusts and their shares, but to raise $10 million to pave this road across the whole country. And they quickly realized that even though $10 million was a lot of money in 1913, it was not going to be enough to get the job done. So they kind of shifted gears to get individual communities excited about having good roads. They would build ideal stretches of road. You can still see some of these today where they would pave 1 mile of flat and smooth crushed stone asphalt road, and people would go out and they would just drive back and forth on this 1 mile stretch of road, and it got them excited about having these kind of high quality roads across the entire country. So by roughly 1926 is where most scholars will estimate the completion of the road actually took place. But over the course of the next 10 years or so, from 1913 until the mid 20s, they slowly started piecing these bits of road together from New York City. So the eastern terminus of the highway is in Times Square, New York City. The western terminus is in Lincoln Park, San Francisco. So when I say it was the first road of its kind in America, I mean is the first road of its kind. It is a paved road all the way across the contiguous continental states in a time when most people didn't own vehicles. Most people didn't drive them. It was a crazy idea, but they pulled it off. And at the time of Fred's trip, to tie it back into the story of the Duesenberg crash, in 1932, when he's making his trip from Philadelphia back out to the Duesenberg plant in Indiana, the Lincoln Highway was it. I mean, it was the only direct route across the state. It was the only direct route west. So when people wonder, what route did he take? What other route would he have taken? I mean, it goes without saying that this was the road he was driving, and not just because from Ray's research, we know the different places that he stopped to get fuel or to get tune-ups or to call home or to pick up hitchhikers, which he'll talk more about later. But this was the only way to get from Philadelphia to Indianapolis on a straight shot. but it was by no means a straight shot. After all, the trip up and over the mountains was a treacherous one. You often had to navigate some pretty substantial curves and twists in the road, and that is ultimately the danger that ended up leading to the accident.
Yeah, and I'm going to point something out. Anybody will be able to find this on the web on my website in historyfromthehomestead.com. Anybody that's familiar with Route 30 now over the mountain, that wasn't the way it was. So what I'll do is I'll post a map with a drawn over line of the old alignment before they took out a lot of those dangerous curves. So I just, anybody that's familiar with that, the road was a lot different then than it is now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're traveling modern Route 30, I describe it to our visitors, it's like the average of the highway. So if we think of Route 30 like a straight line, the original Lincoln Highway would have serpentined left and right on either side of the road, because back then the small towns were where you got food. It's where you refueled. It's where you could stop to spend the night. Nowadays, as the quality of the road is greatly improved and the engineering of the vehicles are much better, you can travel much further today in one day than you could in 1932 when Fred would have been making the drive. So in those days, they wanted to hit many of these small towns, but for the sake of speed, modern Route 30 has bypassed many of them. And a lot of those original stretches of the road are ones that if you don't know what you're looking for, or you don't know that they're out there, are pieces of the Lincoln Highway in its original alignment that you could completely miss if you're staying just on Route 30. And one of those stretches is actually mentioned in Ray's book as part of the original route that is now bypassed.
And when you leave, an example of that, when you leave Jennerstown and it looks like it's straight when you're headed west, you actually are not on any parts of the original road.
Yeah.
The NRA, which was a National Recovery Administration, in 1934, they were found to be unconstitutional in 1935, and it was replaced by the WPA, which was the Workmen's Project Administration. They straightened the road up. They eliminated 9 turns on the eastern side of the Laurel Mountain. And when Fred would have driven up there, he did go on 9 bends, and there was one bend in particular called Pickens Turn, where there was some information that said that's where the accident happened. And it could not have happened at Pickens Turn because he would have been going uphill.
Yeah.
The accident happened going downhill. And the accident happened actually on the west side of the Laurel Mountain. And all of the turns there, with the exception of the really wide bend down on the bottom of the mountain, are as they were in 1932. The road has not changed there. And that's where the accident happened. And when you look at the book on the back cover, it shows actually the road, the part of the road where the accident occurred, which is up closer to the summit and not down on the bottom where they elevated the road down there to make it safer. So the NRA eliminated 9 bends. It made it about a half mile shorter. And none of the road that you drive on today is the original. You can drive on about 6 of the bends, and it would have crossed the existing road 1, 2, 3 times. And I only know that because I hiked it. So that's in the book too. So it was an interesting, supportive piece of information, because when people are here at the museum and they look at that straight road and say, well, it didn't happen. Well, it did happen. You have to turn to the left and go Sliding Rug Golf Course, and there's right off of number 5 hole. There's a piece of cement there that held the sign where the garage was, that when they towed the car to the garage. So, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But the road itself, one other little piece I want to give you. Henry Bourne Joy, he was the CEO of Packard for a decade. He was a big money guy. He was able to get financing for the Packard automobile company, and he was very instrumental in getting the Lincoln Highway done. he was a guy. He was a what they call a waker shaker guy. He can get the people with the money to come up and get that support with the politicians or whatever. So Henry Joy was very significant with that. Henry Joy also made some mistakes. He was supported by prohibition, which was, I think, a bad idea, but we won't go there. But interesting enough to tie in what Spencer's saying, Henry Joy was the CEO for Packard, and he figured we're building these cars. We need roads to drive them on. So that's a lot of how this dream. It was bicycles, put motors on them, put four more wheels on it, and now you're talking about cars and how we evolved into that transcontinental trips. There were companies that would, and I know Packard did it, and there were other companies that did it too. Before the Lincoln Highway, they did make the trip across country, and they were in the mud that he was talking about. There were no roads, so but the endurance of the car was the marketing of the car, which was pretty significant. So anyway, that's my last touch on that aspect. Before we get into the story, unless you have something.
I was just gonna mention for the listeners too that Henry Joy was the founding vice president of the Lincoln Highway Association. So he wasn't just actively involved. He was among the first class of executives that headed up that project. So
interesting. Well, I guess we tap danced around it a little bit, so I guess it's time to talk about the actual crash. That was with the whole premise of the show, and it's interesting because where the original marker was, that's where I always assumed the wreck happened, but it's interesting to know that that's not where it happened at.
That is not where it happened. Actually, I'm going to correct you. There really was no crash. The car spun out, and he was not driving fast. He did blow out a front left tire, and he bent a tie rod, which is a steering mechanism. The car may have had one scratch on it. It did not. It didn't flip over like some of the stories that are out there. When I give my talk, I use Adler's book, and on his cover there, he talks about the car flipping over and Fred dying in the accident. I don't know where he got that information. And there's other information out there that people they talk to someone in town, and people will say things like, "Well, I heard it was this, and I heard it was that." When I was doing my research, they had no clue where the garage was. They had no clue where the accident was. No one in town knew it. They didn't. I had to dig it up. And when I met with a number of people, I met at Dale Holder's house. It was like Andy and Mayberry. We're sitting in 6 chairs, and with the editor Dave Ward and Doug. The electric guy. Anyway,
Doug Black.
Doug Black. And we're sitting there, and there were 2 other people, and it was cool. And I told my story, and they were so, their eyes were up. Well, I thought it was here. Or I thought it was this. I thought it was that. And those guys are car people. They know the history of the area. Larry Heminger, one of the owners of Jennerstown Speedway, had no idea. As I was researching this and sharing it with them, he was very supportive of the project of moving forward with it. So finding information and correcting it, just like I had to correct where the sign went, it was interesting. And again, it's based on the photos and things that I have. So to give you the idea of what happened, if we're starting the story now, Fred Duesenberg was working on a Navy engine, and he had to go to Philadelphia to check on it for Duesenberg. So he took a train into Philadelphia. There was a car that belonged to Robert Ellen, and Robert Ellen was a friend of the Duesenbergs because they used his car to put an experimental supercharger on it. So Robert Ellen was out at their shop quite a few times with his Duesenberg, the car that Fred was driving. So there was some concern, and he told the New York Duesenberg company, if you ship that car down to Philadelphia, I will drive it back. And that's what put him into that car. I thought he drove from New York. I didn't know until I had the legal papers from Fred Duesenberg's wife, Elsa, when she was going for compensation consideration after his death, in the legal papers, it said specifically what he was doing, the days, and he was on the clock. It wasn't a joyride there that he had his accident. And I say that because certainly when you die on the job, you should be compensated accordingly. So at any rate, he agreed to drive the car back. He stayed at his friend Watson's, and Watson had what was called a stabilator. Now the stabilator is a shock absorber, but they introduced the shock absorber into racing as well. If you ever take your shock absorbers off your car one time, try to drive it, it'd be like a pogo stick. It really helped the racing. It helped the car handling and all of that. So Watson, he stayed at his house the night before. And actually, according to the information, Watson said something about his tires weren't the best tires. But of course, Fred was on his way in the morning on July 2nd. That was his purpose to be in Philadelphia. It's his purpose to put him in the seat of that car. It was not his car. It was Robert Ellen's car. It was a rumble seat coupe, supercharged, Murphy-built Duesenberg. So he starts off in the morning. And where I really know a lot about Route 30, because I had to dig into it with the stories from Schellsburg to Jennerstown to here at the museum, is where, to the accident site, to the museum here is my point where I had to really dig in. He stops in Schellsburg. There were 3 garages there. And I have photos of them. I don't know which one he stopped at, but I could only surmise that he stopped at the one that it's now a Dollar General, but it was more of a country store that may have had a phone that he called home, because I do know he called home from Schellsburg and said he'll be home in the evening. The trip was going well. And there were 2 third-year college students that were on their way back home from a wedding in Delaware. They bought a Model T for $25, and it broke down, and they were hitchhiking back to Chicago. The 2 of them were in Schellsburg, not knowing what they were going to do. The one told the other, one was Frank Peacock, told Gordon Langley, walk up the road a little bit. If I get a ride, maybe they'll pick you up too. Went into the store where Fred was, didn't know who Fred was from Adam, didn't know anything. Asked him if he could have a ride back to Chicago. Fred says, sure. So he puts him in the passenger seat. And they go up the road a little bit, and he said, hey, that's my buddy. We're on our way back from our wedding. He said, puts him in a rumble seat. So now this is like someone with a Lamborghini with a rumble seat, putting these 2 guys in this car. They had no idea who Fred was or the car that they were riding in. I'm sure that thing had to rumble a little bit. They had to know it wasn't a Model T. So they headed west, and the trip was going well. In my book, I talk about the Ship Hotel, Grandview, 3 states, 7 counties. I put that in my book because in May of 1932, the ship part of that opened up. So they had the grand opening of the ship portion, because it was just called the Grandview before. And so I added that on. Did he stop there? I don't know. They might have, but I know that it was open at that time. And historically, I think it fits the story. So as they were coming through that, and that was coming up the Allegheny Mountain, and then, the Allegheny Mountain. Then there were 2 big mountains, the Allegheny and then the Laurel Mountain. So the trip was going well. They get into Jennerstown, and Jennerstown, much like Schellsburg, it's a crossroad, and there's little stores and whatever. And there were 9 bends on Route 30 on the east side of the mountain, and he was able to successfully come all the way up those bends without any trouble. I will tell you that I have the weather forecast for those days. It was misty. It wasn't raining. There were several accidents that happened during that weekend of 4th of July. This was a Saturday. It was July 2nd. 4th of July is Monday. So it's a holiday weekend. And were there a lot of cars on Route 30? No. Were there a lot of accidents on a few cars that were there? Yes, because those cars didn't have the tires. The macadam wasn't like we have today. You go around the bends, they were susceptible to sliding off into ditches and things. That was pretty common. Did they have EMS people back then? No, you were transported by whatever ambulance that the funeral home had. Was there a on-call doctor? Yes, his name was Johnson. And I only have that information that came from the hospital death certificate and a local historian had a thing in their Jennerstown Historical Society letter. So I know it was that Dr. Johnson was the attending doctor at the scene, and I know that he also was the doctor in charge at the hospital. I know that the O'Hay funeral home provided the ambulance for him. So what had happened was, and if you go on the road today, the traffic and the traffic patterns and the habits of people coming up the highway, it winds up there. And if you get a real slow car and you go around this bend where it occurred, you can pass the car up there if you have enough momentum coming up. I know that because I saw a modern car do it after I started my story. So the car was passing a car coming up the western side of the mountain, and Fred was coming westerly down the mountain. And this is on the Laurel Mountain on the Westmoreland side of the hill, and he had a ravine to the right and he had a mountainside to the left. He had nowhere to go. So he puts his car into a clockwise spin. He could not have been going faster and been killed. And one of my next things I'm going to do is I have an accident reconstruction friend of mine who's going to do an analysis of speed and that car and how the car actually acted in that accident to have better understanding of it. The suicide door opened up. A suicide door is a hinge in the rear door. So the suicide door opened up when the car went into a clockwise spin. Fred was thrown to the ground. The passenger, who was Frank Peacock, hit his head on the top of the roof because the roof was closed at the time. So Frank Peacock was knocked out. Fred fell out, and the passenger in the back, Gordon Langley, he fell to the road. Now, third-year college students, they get road rash much better than a 55-year-old worn-out race car guy. And so Fred had chest pains, and they took him to the Johnstown Hospital because it was larger than the Ligonier Hospital. The other two, as I understand, were taken to Ligonier, and they were treated. I don't know how they got back to Chicago, but somehow they got back to Chicago. And by the way, it was illegal to hitchhike in Pennsylvania. So it wasn't until the state policeman at the scene told their two hitchhikers that Fred Duesenberg is who he is, and he built the car, and who he is, and that was the first time that they knew about the car. So that's what put Fred into the hospital. So we can talk about his accident, his health at this point in time, or we can talk about the car. Which direction you want to go?
Well, we might as well finish out with his health because
okay. All right,
that'll complete it out.
Okay. So his health, in my PowerPoint, I have a chronology of his stay at the hospital. Of course, on July 2nd, it happened. His wife and his son, Denny, and his name is Denny, not Dennis, because his wife was Elsa Denny Duesenberg. That was her maiden name. And typically, the maiden names were middle names for boys. And he was doing well. The only thing they can do back then would do flat x-rays. So they were able to find that he had a fractured scapula because he had a dislocated shoulder, and he had two mid-range ribs that were fractured. And in his tailbone, they're called processes, little bony pieces that had some fractures there. Didn't appear to be anything really serious. He wrote a letter to his wife that said, I'll be home and I'll be out of here in 2 or 3 days. He didn't take it very seriously. I will tell you a little bit later why I think maybe his injuries were serious. So they didn't have anything to treat him with. What they did was treat him with oxygen tent. They brought a special oxygen tent. It was a state-of-the-art oxygen tent from Pittsburgh for him. and he was doing well. They actually were taking the oxygen away from him in bits and pieces. But then on the 20 on the 26th, he had a relapse, and they said he had a heart attack and he died of pneumonia. Well, what I found out that he had pneumonia 7 times prior to this because of his involvement with racing and engine development and the fumes and things. He didn't realize how that was damaging his body, I'm sure. So with just the flat X-rays, the death certificate, which I have a copy of in the book, it specifically states that he died of bronchopneumonia, and that was the best thing they knew at the time. I had a modern day emergency room doctor do an analysis of just the death certificate. He didn't have the medical records, but just from the death certificate, he said that scapular fracture was a high impact. The mid-range were high impact. More than likely, there was a contusion to the lung, which would have led into some internal bleeding that could only be diagnosed with a CT scan that didn't exist back then. So his conclusion, and it's a little bit longer than that, but I'm just kind of summarizing it. His conclusion was pretty much he had internal bleeding, and that's what added to the problem that he had with pneumonia as well. So I think the 2 and 2 may have gone hand in hand. On the sign, it said that he had serious injuries, and initially I said, yeah, they weren't serious. I didn't agree with it for the longest time until I received this analysis from my emergency room doctor, and I have changed my opinion on it. I think he did have serious injuries. So he died. He died 23 days later at 7. He was 55 years old. It was 7:38 in the morning on the 26th. He was 55, 7 months and 20 days old, and the cause of death was listed as bronchopneumonia. So that's what happened to him. The 2 hitchhikers, I don't know. They were treated at Ligonier, and somehow they got home. Frank Peacock will come back up in our story. If I forget, you'll remind me. He's kind of cool. His name will come up later on in the story. But that's what happened with his health. And if there's any comment or anything at this point in time, because we're at a conclusion with that aspect of the story.
Well, I don't have any, so I say we should talk about the car now because there's plenty of story behind that as well.
Oh, absolutely. Let's talk about the car, because I like to talk about all this stuff. Obviously, years of research and the facts that back it up give me some confidence. Anyway, the car was towed to a garage that was at the Sliding Rock Golf Course. It was the garage was in front of an old white schoolhouse where the existing hole number 5 of the Sliding Rock Golf Course is. And there's 2 aspects of this. I'm going to tell you what happened to the car, and then I'm going to tell you how we found more information through the brothers. So Ted Brandt was the proprietor of the garage, and Eugene Walter's dad, Jack, owned the garage, the facility. So Ted Brandt had a converted Pierce Arrow tow truck. It was a Pierce Arrow car that was converted into a tow truck, which was quite common back then. All of the cars back then had wood structure. The wood would rot, and they would repurpose them. The chassis and everything would work. So could you imagine a Pierce Arrow tow truck pulling a Duesenberg up the mountain to the garage? Because that's what happened. It was about 2 miles up away from the accident scene, and Fred or Ted Brandt, he knew that was a special car. It was kind of like I keep calling it a Lamborghini because it was a special car, and so he pulled it in the garage and worked on it immediately. Put a spare tire on, straightened up the tie rod, and drove it up and down. He knew there was nothing wrong with the car. It never flipped over. Fred Duesenberg was not killed in the car. He was still much alive for 20-some days. So the state patrolman called the Duesenberg company, and they said, well, we'll send someone out at the end of the 4th of July weekend. So now you have to keep in mind, we didn't have a lot of attorneys back then. So Ted Brandt was driving this car. He would drive it to the top of the mountain on each day to put it on display so people could see it. One of the days he let Eugene Walter, who was 18 years old. He hung out in the garage. This was the son of Jack, who owned the building, and he let him drive the car. So again, my story is based on people that owned, touched, and drove the car. So there are two people that I talked to that drove that car. And one is Eugene, or I have a tape of Eugene Walter. I talked to his sons, and Bob Friggins, who owned the car for 35 years. So at any rate, so they eventually did send a car carrier type of thing out to tow the car back out to Indianapolis. What they did was they gave Robert Ellen credit for the car, and they took it back, and then they repurposed it. The car was burgundy initially, and when it came out, and they had trouble selling this car. When they came out a second time, it took them a year and a half to sell the car because it was considered a death car because Fred's accident, even though Fred wasn't killed in the car. They had a tough time selling it. So when it came out the second time, it was yellow. And as the car went for the next 35 years after that, when it was purchased, it was green. When Bob Friggins bought it in 1972, he brought it back to the yellow original color and original condition of the big headlights and the front fenders. He had to change to make them original in the grill. But the car really wasn't molested. So he made it look exactly like when it came out of the factory the second time. I have copies of the photos from the factory that he gave me, Bob Friggins gave me. So as the car goes on, I'll just tell you this story. Duesenberg is a German name, and they built a car that could not be more American. Where do you think the car resides now? It's in Germany. Oh. Randy Ema, who's the guru of the Duesenberg stuff, he received all of Fred Duesenberg's papers, drawings, and notes and personal things from his son Denny. When Denny passed away, he willed it all to Randy Ema, and Randy Ema's name will come up with Jay Leno and different things because he's pretty much the purveyor of all of that information and history of it. So, but that's what happened to the car. That's where the car is now. Their dad, Eugene Walter, and there were three sons, Mark, Paul, and Jack. Their dad always talked about driving the car. So when their dad was 89 years old for his birthday, they called Randy Ema, and they found out that who owned the car. It was Bob Friggins from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he was coming to Hershey. So they created the situation where they could meet. He wanted to meet Eugene Walter, who drove the car in 1932, and so there's a picture in the book of Eugene Walter standing at the exact bend where the accident happened. Again, people who drove, touched, and owned the car. That's what I based my facts on. I have a picture of Eugene when he was 18, when he drove the car, and there's a picture when he's 89 when he found the car. So it's kind of cool. So talking with the sons, how did I find the sons? I went to the post office in Jennerstown, and I was posting up, hey, I'm looking for information on the Walter family or whatever. And there's an older gentleman there. So, oh, I know where he lives. He lives on a Lakeshore and something drive. So, and then I went to Milt's Garage, and they knew Mark. Mark lived in town, and it was over COVID, and I had to step over some snow to get to his house. But I was able to get phone numbers, and that was the start of really digging into the information. So that's when my story truly happened. And their brother Jack had a lot of information that he wrote letters and things that he shared with me. My conversation with Bob Friggins, I've had over a half dozen conversations with him. He's 90 years old, loves to talk about the car, has tremendous recall of the car. And that started, the factual solidifying of the story. So looking for where the garage was, no one in town knew where the garage was, where it was towed. No one knew. So we looked at family photos, and I have the pictures of the family people where you can see the background. You can see the school, and you can see the garage. Actually, we have a picture of Ted Brandt in front of the garage. right by the gas pumps, and he's smoking a cigarette. It was kind of cool. Gasoline didn't explode back then, I guess. I don't know.
It was okay back then, yeah.
Yeah,
It had that lead in it. It was okay.
Yeah. So I have pictures. Those are photos that I was able to obtain. Finding the information was just the more I looked, the more information I found, and the more excited I was, and more motivated I was to do this story. And again, initial story was for the magazine, and then when it talked to the book, doing the book, I had a lot of things that weren't in the magazine article that pretty much fit in the book. And actually, quite honestly, I have more information that's not in the book that will be in the next edition if I do another one. So that's how we found where the garage was. Right now, there's a cement piece there where there was a shell sign that was there. I looked at one of the family photos. There was a King Edward sign, but way back in the background, you could see the shell sign, and that's where the garage was. So there is one hunk of cement there that I am going to paint or do something to indicate that that's the location of the garage, just for posterity. So I know where the garage was. I know the ambulance from O'Hay drove him to the hospital. I know Dr. Johnson took care of it. I know that the Henderson Funeral Home in Johnstown prepared his body before he sent it out to Indianapolis. So all of that local history, the legacy kind of things, I have that nailed down. And that's pretty much that part of it. And there's one other little piece that he's going to remind me about, so that I can't let go. I don't know. Do you have any questions at this point in time, or any comments?
No.
Okay.
No,
So as time goes on, 50 years later, Gordon Burek, who was the head designer for Duesenberg. See, when you had a Duesenberg, you purchased the chassis, the motor, the instrumentation. They ran them on the Indianapolis Speedway 500 miles to make sure they went over 100 miles in second gear and 100 miles in third gear before they went to the custom bodybuilders. And there were 14 of them. Murphy was the bodybuilder that built the car he was driving. And Rolston was another one. There were quite a few different names of the bodybuilders, and they were all wood. The bigger the car, the longer the wheelbase from the front to the back. The custom car people like that because they can do more creative things there. The longest ones were 152 inches, and the smaller ones were 142 inches. And then they had a special supercharged one that Gary Cooper and Clark Gable had, which was, I think it was 139 inches, which was still a long car. At any rate, the 150 some inches would be almost like a hearse, if you think of it. So that's the custom bodies that were built for them. The market, all the movie stars wanted them. They wanted to be seen by them or whatever, and that's how that came to be. It was very successful. 1937 was the last year that they made the Duesenbergs, and E.L. Cord, was able to achieve his dream of having the Cord automobile in his name. He actually, to get his money and whatever through selling cars over and over again, he was able to purchase the Auburn car company. So that's a whole nother story. He has a very interesting story, but he did get a lot of his money through selling and through cars and transportation in general. So that's pretty much how that happened. One of the coolest things that happened in my story, and it was when Gordon Burek was talking about his design, because he would have to approve all the designs before those cars were built, because they wanted to protect the brand. They didn't want somebody just to make something that was going to be embarrassing to a Duesenberg brand. So, and the people with deep pockets, they were pretty creative. There were a couple of books, one by Albert and one by Fred Rowe, that are the Bibles of Duesenberg. They have quite a few examples of them. And Gordon Burek, who was the head designer, never had enough money to own a Duesenberg, by the way. And so he's giving this speech in Sun City, Arizona, retirement area. And he talks about his role as a designer. he talked about Fred Duesenberg's accident. When he was done, this guy comes up to him and looks at him in the eye and said, "It didn't happen that way." He said, "What do you mean?" He says, "My name's Frank Peacock. I was in the car." So Frank Peacock. So in 1981, Gordon Buick wrote an article entitled "How It Really Happened." So that's a kind of a cool
Wow.
drawing together of the facts. And it was one of the 4 articles that my friend Barry gave me to read that really got me started. And as I found all the information and went through, it's just kind of cool to how everything kind of tied in. And that's pretty much the story. You know, it's an interesting book. There's a lot of stories within it. There's the Elsa Duesenberg. She had 2 lawsuits trying to get some compensation. One she lost, and she ended up filing a second one through the insurance that he had because of being the vice president of the company, and she won that one. Took her 6 years. The amount of money she got after 6 years would have been the same amount if she would have won the first lawsuit. But the facts in the legal paper there, I can't think of the guy's name. Don Ray. He's an attorney from out in Illinois. He was working for a company, and he dug into this archives, and he was able to get the information from the court hearings, which the write-ups in there had a lot of factual information that has to be accurate because it was put into the legal paperwork that was there, and it was filed in her behalf. So I met him at the Auburn Court Duesenberg Festival just by happenstance, and he actually read my article. I didn't have my book done by then, but he read my article and was very familiar with it. Gave me a copy of his article. We've talked a number of times. So, facts are everywhere, and I tell Spencer here, it's just cool. It's a cool part of journalism. I was an industrial arts teacher for 10 years and a principal for 26. I like to write. So am I an English major? No. Matter of fact, the editor, Dave Ward, who's a retired professor from Pitt Johnstown, his initial assessment of me was to say, "Ray, I'll give you A+ in content, I'll give you a B- in English." And I said, "B- in English? I never got a grade that high in English. Someday I'll take that. That's awesome." So I tell people, don't let English get in the way of a good story. Tell your story. We have editors. When you do a book, you have the editor that does the English stuff. There's a book designer that puts it in order. But the author's in charge of the story. It's my story. So,
wow. Before we end out, Ray, where can we find your book? Here's your chance to brag about it for a second. Where can we find it?
Okay, you can find the book here at the museum. It's on sale here. It's actually on sale in Jennerstown as well at the 1806 antique place there. Chris has it there. I have it in my house as well. I'm self-published. I purchased over 1,000 of them because of the cost of them. It was more cost efficient to purchase 1,000 instead of 500. I've sold about 450 so far. If somebody wants that book, they can. My contact information. You have the museum and you have the 1806. If you're here, my contact information is Old Cars, OLDCARZ and Zebra at Comcast.net. My phone number is 814-244-0496. I live in Sidman. If someone contacts me, the book is $25, and usually the postage is another $5. So it's $25 with the postage. If I'm giving my talk, of course, I discount it when I'm doing it. And what's it cost here?
I think we've got it at
30.
Yeah, $29.99 or something like that.
So, and then it's on sale at the AACA Museum in Hershey. It's on sale at the Gilmore Museum in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Interesting enough, the lady who's in charge of the bookstore at the Auburn Court Duesenberg Museum didn't want to carry the book because she didn't want to do consignments. So I'm at the mercy of the person in charge of the gift store. I got him in a headlock. That's why we could do it here.
There's nothing we love more than a well-researched local story for the Lincoln Highway. So we were all too happy to buy him by the box. Yeah,
we've done pretty well. He's already sold a box of them. Yeah, we're in our second box.
Great.
So
Spencer,
to answer your story, you can get them from me. That's my contact information. Or if you're here, you can get it from here. You can go to the 1806 and those other places if you're out and traveling.
Spencer, I'm going to give you a chance. Brag about the museum for a few. Let's hear about it.
So we are just like the Lincoln Highway it was the first road of its kind. We are kind of the only museum of our kind to tell the story of the Lincoln Highway in as much depth and as much detail with as much square footage as we do. We are currently in the new building of the museum. So just over my shoulder here is the side of the tourist cabin that we have here inside the museum. You can see the motel signs that we have as well. What you can't see on camera, we have a completely fully restored 1938 diner that you finish the tour in with pie and coffee. We have currently on display a 1937 Packard 120 just on the other side of the camera. We got donated just a couple weeks ago a 1927 Model T that we are planning to rotate in to the museum to have on display as well. So we've got tons of exhibit spaces telling the story of the highway, highlighting many of the sites that you can see in Western Pennsylvania as part of our 6-county heritage region. We have rotating exhibits coming in all the time. The Duesenberg exhibit that Ray and I worked on to put in the museum is here indefinitely until such a time as we have other long-term intentions for that exhibit space. It's here, so come out and see it while you can. And it's about as cool a museum experience as you could possibly hope to get. I'm going to step off camera here for just a second. Like, you can come and step on an old driveway signal in front of our gas station and ring the bell and have some pie and coffee and learn about the rich history that's not just here in our backyard, but I mean, literally, you pull out of our parking lot to the right, you keep going and you make it to New York City eventually. You pull out to the left and you make it to California. So it's rich history right here that not a lot of people are aware of.
And you have that detailed map or the directions you could follow for the sites to see, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, included with every admission is the pie and coffee at the end of the tour. We have a stamped postcard from the museum, so you can write a note of your travels to your friends and family, just like they would have done before we carry cameras around in our pockets that we can make phone calls and text people with. They sent postcards. That's how they would tell people where they were, what they were doing. So we give you one of those that you can mail out from the museum, and also included is a copy of our recently revised Lincoln Highway driving guide. So for Westmoreland through Adams counties, it'll tell you turn by turn exactly how to follow the original route of the highway, as many of the alignments of it that still exist. Ray obviously was talking about a portion that you can only hike, but of the drivable alignments that still exist, it'll tell you how to find them, and it'll point out all of the notable cultural, natural, industrial resources, the highlights from back in the day as you drive. So
again, we talk about the part that I'm familiar with from Ligonier to Shellisburg. I have driven every part of the old road and the new road. And I'm going to get this guy to hike the old road with me too. He's going to hike the top of that mountain with me. We'll do it when it's cooler and do it. But it's kind of neat because from Ligonier, you can take the old Route 30 and it comes back into the existing one. And just like at the top of the mountain, when they had the original sliding rock was a huge rock that was on top of the mountain, and it was blown up when the NRA straightened the road up. They had to do a lot of blasting there. My friend Barry S. has a poster of NRA, and its insignia was a blue eagle. If you look it up, you'll find that. And we also have a license plate was on one of the trucks that was removing the stones back then. It's hanging in his garage. It's a picture of it's in my book, 1934. But you can actually, from Sliding Rock, at the top of the mountain, you can go past the Sliding Rock golf course. And you can do, I believe there's about six or seven turns that you can still do. you can experience Pickens' turn, because someone said that it happened there. It couldn't happen with Pickens Bend because he was headed west and he would have been going uphill. It happened going downhill. We pretty much nailed where it happened. It didn't happen anywhere near there. And there's so many of the misinformation pieces that were out there because, things went by word of mouth. And I look for, just to give you an idea of how I research the articles. When you write, you start with an outline and then you write. When I do research, I read the article and I outline, and I look for facts and things that say I was there, I touched it, I saw it, I know it. Not I heard it was here. We understand it was here. Like when you go buy a car and it says it's understood that it has original miles of 10,000 miles on it. That's wrong. It has certified 10,000 miles. So there's a big difference in the vernacular. And in my notes, I always underline and outline, and then you compile all of the facts together, and then you establish what the story is. So just a little bit about the writing process.
Gentlemen, I thank you. We covered well over an hour of this. I wasn't sure how long it would run, and an hour later, man, time flies.
Yes, it does. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I thank you both.
Spencer talks too much.
Well, when you're doing a show, it's great to have someone who talks. It makes it so much easier. So,
well, I will tell you this. I encourage questions. So if you have any questions from your podcast or whatever, people can contact me. I'd be happy to talk about things. I had someone question my book when I was down in Hershey this past October, and he was telling me about things. I said, no, my research says something different. So I told him, I said, here's my book. It's $20. Read my book. If this doesn't convince you, I'll send you your $20 back. Well, he gave me an email that said, oh my goodness, your book was awesome. I'm convinced of this. Give me your contact stuff. I will advertise it in our newsletter. So again, the facts are there. They're pretty solid. And again, as you know, as you've experienced, it's easy to tell the story when you have those kind of facts.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. And quite a story it is. So, gentlemen, again, thank you both for joining me today. It was interesting and exciting.
And thank you, Thomas, for giving us an opportunity to tell this story on your show. And thank you to all your listeners as well.
And I say thank you as well. And you need to buy my book.
Yes, buy his book. We will say that. Buy Ray's book. Go to the museum and buy his book.